Welcome, my friends, to the Quay Radio Hour, your home for free and critical thinking, and I'm your host, Mike Williams. Tonight, my very special guest is Bob Shroyer. Bob is a local North Carolinian anti-geoengineering activist, and he also runs the global air, water, soil safety website, GAWSS.org. My discussion with Bob was wide-ranging as we focused on the challenges local activists encounter in their efforts to wake people up to the geoengineering agenda and the ensuing consequences to humanity. And to kick our conversation off, I asked Bob to take us through his journey in life and how he became an activist after a very lengthy corporate career. And here is what he had to say.
So, Bob, thank you very much for coming on the show. And I wanted to bring somebody, an activist, on the show that is involved in geoengineering at a grassroots level. Because there's a lot of folks that are waking up to what's going on in the skies. And once they do wake up, what happens is many times they don't know who to speak to. They don't know who they can talk to about this. And also, I mentioned to one activist on Facebook, I said, we really have to make folks understand that we have more than 5 geoengineering experts worldwide. A lot of times folks tend to focus on the big names, and they don't realize that there are a lot of folks doing a lot of hard work and a lot of good work locally. And I do believe one of the ways that we can stop this is by getting the local activity really engaged. So, and you're one of those people. And what I'd like to do is just to get started with things, because you're a first-time guest on the show, is perhaps if you can just give us a little background on your journey in life and how you ultimately ended up being a geoengineering activist.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mike, for having me on this show, because I listen and watch a lot of shows on the Internet related to geoengineering, the financial collapse, and what have you. So it's actually fun for one time to actually be the interviewee, I suppose. So anyway, I appreciate that. I guess my life has pretty much consisted of, growing up, working in corporate America for 30 years, eventually getting out of corporate America right after, in the early 2000s, as many people had been affected by changes in the industry at that time. I then joined my wife, who was engaged in a craft industry, fiber arts industry, where she was making tools, and she was making very small things, and I joined her, and we started to upgrade the whole approach to the tool-making business, and we ended up actually becoming number one in the industry, which is very interesting when you're essentially working out of your house.
Yeah.
So that was a fun process, I can assure you, and we still do that to this day. In fact, we're very, very successful in that business. So that was a great career change for me, although I wouldn't have known that at the time. But in any event, so I went down that path, and it seemed that after 9/11, 9/11 really was the point at which I opened my eyes to a lot of different things. I knew going into the Iraq war that there's something that didn't smell right. In fact, I kept having heavy discussions with a lot of my friends that this wasn't right. There was something really bad about the whole decision to go into Iraq. I just knew from day one. I knew that George Bush was headed down the wrong road. And sure enough, we went down that road. It turned out to be a disaster, rather. And as I learned more about the whole 9/11 event over the years following that, that's sort of when I call passing through the membrane. I actually experienced, this wake-up call that made me look at just about everything completely differently than I had before. And it was sort of like when you've gone through that membrane, once you're on the other side, nothing is ever really the same. And I looked at everything differently, whether it was false flag events, financial collapses, all the different things that we see nowadays and have seen for some time going on. 99% of the time it's with the government. The government really is the bad actor here, it seems, in many, many cases. So it just seemed if you just watched the government's activities day to day, you were going to find a lot of things that didn't make any sense. So one of those things was, in fact, geoengineering. Now, I'm not quite sure how I originally fell upon the geoengineering situation, but I do know that once I started looking into it, it was just like the other things. It just didn't make any sense. Why would they be spraying this stuff up in the sky? Why aren't they telling us about it? And, so on and so forth. So as you dig into it more and more, you find out, oh yeah, this doesn't make any sense, and in fact, it's pretty dangerous. Then you start hearing about the species dying off, and really nobody's talking about it in a systematic way. They may be talking about birds dying on the beach over on the West Coast today, and maybe you'll find some bees dying over here in North Carolina on another day, but nobody's putting the pieces together.
Yeah. Yep.
So that makes you wonder, why are they not putting it all together and making it clear to us? So I guess what I'm saying is, I had a normal life, a normal career. I made a change in my career, and then it seemed like I started looking at things primarily because of 9/11. 9/11 really was the turning point for me. I was a truther. I'm still a truther. I have a website on it. I've done a lot of research. I've now moved on to these other things, but 9/11 really is still at the foundation, I would say, of my change in understanding.
Now, when you had the 9/11 really awakening, I think that was a turning point for a lot of people, Bob. It was a turning point for me too. It's just initially when it first happened, I was going along with the storyline, and then little by little after that, a lot of things really didn't add up. They didn't stack up. And so I started questioning things, and that's basically how I started getting into it. So 9/11 was my starting point, too. Now, when you had these conversations with folks about 9/11, I'm assuming that these weren't all very easy conversations. Did you have a lot of people that just essentially looked at you and said, "You're crazy"?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember taking my friend to a bar a couple times just to get away from things and try to have a couple of drinks with them to try to explain to them that... And this was before we attacked Iraq. I knew deep in my heart that was a bad decision. I knew for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons was, and we see this still to this day, by the way, with Syria, there's never any news people that go and interview, the key player in the whole thing, Assad.
Right.
They also then go and interview, Hussein there, or anybody in Iraq. So what you discover from that is that we're actually keeping our people away. We don't want to know what the truth is. We don't want to know what the answers are. So we just prevent anybody from contacting those people. So I knew when I started seeing that there was something was wrong about the whole situation. Now, we still see that to this day. In fact, one of the things I wanted to talk about was that there's never an opportunity, it seems, on any of these topics to have an open forum discussion with the powers to be on a given subject. Like, for example, let's say we had a subject that we wanted to talk to the FAA about, or to...
or the EPA.
EPA. EPA is what I was going to say, and FDA, for example.
Right.
You can never really have an open discussion. Everything is restricted. And it started back around the time of 9/11. And I think that's continued. They've actually learned some really good lessons, it seems, the government, in terms of keeping us all at bay here. We can't really ask any questions. We know for a fact, one more thing I'll say on that topic is that, even in the White House, they have that new press room. And you know that those people they're highly restricted in what they can ask. If they ask any tough questions, they're never going to see the light of day in there again.
That's right.
You know that.
That's right.
That's been going on for 20 years now, it seems. So, but in any event, those discussions I had were tough with people, especially with my family. By the way, my wife doesn't see any of this the same way I see it, so I pretty much am not able to have a good, intelligent conversation with her on the subject. My son, he's much more open to it. My daughters are somewhere on the fence. So it's not a fun topic, quite frankly, to bring up. And because it occupies such a high percentage of my free time, you can imagine that it's a little disruptive. And I'm sure a lot of I call ourselves anti-geoengineers, by the way.
Yep.
So we use that term just because we've got to call ourselves something, I suppose. But I imagine a lot of people, and I see that frustration on the web when I read postings, that you can tell a lot of these folks, they have strong feelings. They're not able to openly discuss a lot of that, I'm sure, with many of their loved ones. So what about yourself, Mike?
No, the same thing. I have, my partner, Rebecca, she completely gets it. My daughter gets it. But outside of that, other folks in my family, my immediate family, they just chalk it up as these are contrails and you're crazy. Take your tinfoil hat off, Mike. There's nothing to see here. There's nothing to worry about. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. So it's very frustrating because, this is programming that they haven't broken. They're very much programmed. They're conditioned. And, one of the things, Bob, I'm 57 years old, so I remember back when I was a kid, I would look at the sky, and the skies did not look like this.
Right.
They just did not look like this. And we had jets back in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and we didn't have skies that looked like this. So it's always amazing to me when I speak to family members that are around my age, and they should have clear recall about what the skies used to look like. And they don't. They just shut it down,
I think others have studied this much more probably than you and I as to why we get this reaction from people. What do they call it? Cognitive dissonance?
Yeah, cognitive dissonance, yeah.
It's something they just don't want to know about, they don't want to deal with. And, it would be amazing if all of a sudden tomorrow we could have the government come out and say, yes, we've been spraying, we've been doing it for these reasons, we've been lying to you, but, it really was for your own good. Now, I wonder what those people would say and do at that point. I surmise they would probably just say, oh, okay, we see now, we understand. So they would go back to their normal day.
Well, they would go to you and I and say, see, I told you.
They probably do. But one of the things I've learned is that, first of all, you got to move past that, I found out. I can't waste a lot of time with people that they're not going to open their mind. Somebody said, I heard on TV one time or on the web, I can't remember, somebody said if a mind will only work if it's open.
Right.
And if it's not open, it's not going to work. So I think we see a lot of that nowadays. I know, I'm not going to mention any names of my family, but I do see some people that watch a lot of TV. And while they're watching TV, it could be some reality show or a music show or whatever it is, they're like zombies.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, I'm on the computer doing research, and my mind's working the whole time. So I got to believe we have two groups of people, it seems, in our society. One that rather relax and just take it easy, and then there's a bunch of us who want to get something done. And so that's good, I suppose. At least we have different types of people because we certainly need them. I often think that we're the last guards on the road to hell. If they get past us, there's no stopping them. And we're the only people that are trying to stop this crazy activity that we see. And it could be chemtrails today. It could be martial law tomorrow.
Yeah.
It could be any number of things that are happening. And here again, these same qualities that we see in people and how they address stress and controversy, we see it time and time again. It just seems that they don't want to deal with it.
Yeah, I think I was having a conversation today, had an earlier interview with Kara St. Louis, and we touched on this a little bit about people being conditioned and programmed and apathetic and just really not caring. And I explained to her, I said that that the artificial intelligence, the AI that they keep talking about, that's coming, isn't coming, it's already here. And it's here in the form of just massive mind control and propaganda. And what's happened is the AI is the conditioning. It's the conditioning for people to be apathetic, to be disengaged, to focus on inane things. Like you said, you have people sitting there watching TV, they're in a trance, taking in really the most incredibly stupid stuff that it can possibly be presented to them, and watching that and absorbing that. And you have to think to yourself, at least I do, because I see this with the kids. They sit down, they watch like the Cartoon Network, or they're watching these seedy types of animated adult types of shows with all kinds of sexual innuendo and everything else being thrown at them, and they think that this is fun. They think that this is a way to sit back and enjoy watching television. It never dawns on them that they should shut it off and they should actually do some real things to go engage their mind and critically think and free think. Like you said, go upstairs and do some research. Go upstairs, read a good book. Go watch a good documentary. But instead, a large portion of the population is AI'd. They are numb to free thinking and critical thinking. They're just going to sit there and they're going to have their apathy and be disengaged.
I saw a picture on the web, one of the sites today, that showed about 12 young people. They looked like junior high or maybe high school people, but they were sitting on benches at a museum, and there were some very historical paintings in the back. I'm sure I didn't know what they were, but they were something in Europe. And these people were all sitting on the benches looking at their cell phones.
Right.
And here they were. This was a class trip, apparently. They got off from school to go to this museum. And that's what they were doing. You know, they weren't looking at any of the pictures. Now, of course, maybe the pictures were a little boring. Who knows? But still, the fact that they were all sitting around doing the same exact thing is a little disturbing. You know, nobody was doing anything different. So that's just a sign of the times, I guess, we live in. And technology that we've given to them is actually flip-flopped on us in a sense, that they're not actually doing a heck of a lot with that technology. You know?
No, and the thing is, you mentioned before about being the last obstacle in the way of the controllers putting the agenda really, really into play. And I agree with that because, you know, what they're doing clearly is they're going after the youth. They're conditioning the youth. I mean, NASA came out, I know you probably know this, but they came out with a brochure for kids in elementary school trying to teach them and show them new clouds. They're chemtrails. And they're trying to teach these kids that these chemtrails, these are new clouds. So when you look up in the sky and you see X's and circles and semicircles and all this weird stuff up there, those are just different clouds. We never had these clouds before, but now we have new clouds. We don't have new dirt. We don't have new rocks. We don't have new grass and new trees, but we have new clouds.
One thing I was going to say, Mike, is that because I have a couple of websites, a number of them are non-diplomed, where I don't identify myself, so I don't give them out. But when I'm out searching for pictures that are legal to use, oftentimes I'll use a big stock photo or something, or I purchase the pictures. What you'll see in many of these commercial pictures now are chemtrails.
Right.
In fact, if you look at any images on TV or even on the web, just about anywhere now, you're going to see a chemtrail in the background. In fact, I have a picture of the Capitol that I put on one of my sites, and sure enough, there are a couple of chemtrails, you know, going over.
Oh yeah.
So this has been going on. It has to have been going on for a long time. I know Dane Wigington says it's been going on for decades and decades. I don't remember, quite frankly, going back that far, but who knows? Maybe it has been. I know certainly in the last 10 years it's really been heavy. The last 5 has been super heavy.
Right.
And I don't know whether it was back in the 90s or not. I think they discovered a lot of these technologies back in the early 90s from what I read.
Yeah, I remember going back maybe 20 years and noticing these long lines. At the time, you know, I wasn't on the anti-geoengineering track. But I remember, you know, we'd look up and, you know, okay, that's kind of interesting. Yeah, that contrail is running from horizon to horizon. So, okay, so what's that about? But that was it. I didn't give it any more thought. But I agree with you that the last decade, and especially the last 5 years, have been unbelievable. Just unbelievable. Right. Now, I tell folks all the time, Bob, being here in North Carolina, because I'll speak to my friends, you know, do the radio shows, and they'll say, so Mike, you know, how's the weather there? I said, well, it would be good. I said, if it wasn't for the fact that we're completely saturated with aerosols.
Well, the other day, I don't know when it was a week on a weekend. I think it was not this past Sunday, but the Sunday before. Yeah, it was the Sunday before. And I was going over to Raleigh somewhere, and I didn't see any chemtrails in the sky at all. And what day was that? That was a holiday, I recall. But in any event, maybe it wasn't a holiday, but it was some day that it was clearly a Sunday, and they must have given the guys a day off. There are no chemtrails. There are no contrails. So I wish I would have had a few of my friends with me right there to point out to me where those contrails were on that day, because I could show them my app on my phone, which is planefinder.net, I think it is.
Yeah.
It shows you all the aircraft that are up there, so we know they're up there. So why would they on that particular day not have any contrails at all, if they're in fact contrails? And you and I both know they're chemtrails.
Right.
But once in a while you'll see a contrail on a rare occasion. Typically there's no contrails because they don't make them anymore with the latest engine technology.
Yeah, the high bypass.
The high bypass
engines.
turbine.
Yeah.
It's just kind of interesting when you see that. I always try to point that out, but again, you know, if my wife's in the car and I point that out to her, she'll give me the eagle, the dirty look, you know, so I don't want to get up with her. So, because I know that's going to go downhill rapidly. But I think if you're with somebody who is maybe a little bit more open-minded on that subject, that's a good time to point out to them that, hey, I don't see any contrails up there today. Where did they go? And then show them all the planes that are up there. If you happen to have your phone with you, you can show them the planes are overhead.
Yeah.
But one of the things I wanted to point out was why is this geoengineering, dangerous? As you mentioned in the beginning, I'm a newbie at this. I'm not a highly experienced professional that's been looking at this for a long time. But, what I do see is I take note of all the species that are dying off. And whenever I see that happen, I try to contact the scientist who is named in the article as being the person in charge of investigating that species die-off. And I have a list on my website. And what I always find, whether it be with Alzheimer's, it could be an Alzheimer's doctor as well. But oftentimes it's birds or bees or what have you. They never, ever, ever recognize the possibility of aluminum coming from chemtrails as being the cause. What they'll end up telling you is that, well, the birds all starved to death. Okay, why did they starve to death? Well, their food supply probably died. And why did their food supply die? You have to go back. It's like, going back to a science class and trying to figure out what's happening. You and I probably can get to the answer in about 3 milliseconds. But you have to drag these people back, and then it's like pushback the whole way. What I've figured out from all that is that these organizations, these universities, these scientists, we certainly know the weathermen have been gagged, but anybody who's getting funding from the federal government,
right,
whether it be through their employer, their university, they're getting grants, let's say. I'm assuming, I've never seen the document, but I'll bet you because of the reactions I see from these people, is that there's wording on those agreements that they are not to discuss geoengineering. Now, how that's phrased, I don't know. But there's some theme that just carries through all these discussions. I even had a couple discussions with pilots, a pilot that I know, and another pilot that I didn't really know, although I dealt with him. He was a 9/11 Pilots for Truth guy. I don't want to mention his name here. I don't want to ruin his business, because I really respected the guy. I thought he did a great job. But you can't believe the conversation I had with him. And here's a guy that's a 9/11 truther, and I could swear by the discussions that we were having that he was being gagged as a pilot.
Yep.
And I think the pilot's licensing situation, I think the grant money, all these documents from the federal government, somehow or another, wherever there's money involved, they are being gagged. Now, have you heard of that before, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question in my mind that they're being gagged. I mean, I saw some clips, and you probably saw the same clips, where a weatherman will explain to the audience that this is chaff, or this is these are contrails, and I mean, and clearly, anybody with a half a brain in their head is watching this television and saying, "What are you talking about? That plane is spraying stuff every which way from Sunday," So there is a gag in place, Bob. And the thing is, what goes on is they hold their jobs over their heads. So if anybody says anything that sounds like a quote-unquote conspiracy theory, at the very least, they're going to be called into the office, right? They're going to be saying, "Hey, Dave, could you come here for a second? What are you talking about? Chemtrails? Are you a conspiracy theorist, Dave? We don't want that kind of talk in the office or in this agency or this institution, whatever it may be. We don't pay you to do those types of things. So, you need to get back to business. And if you talk about this stuff again, it could be a problem. And so what happens is, everybody's got to put food on the table. Everybody's got to pay a mortgage. They've got kids and, whatnot. And so this is what they do. They apply the economic pressure. It's basically, economic terrorism that is pushed upon these folks. And, what are most people going to do? Are they cowards? But somebody can say, well, they should talk about it anyway. It's just a job. Well, you know what? It's a lot more complicated than that. So I understand what they're going through. That's why we don't see a lot of whistleblowers. And if you're a high-level whistleblower, then you could have a real problem. You could possibly just disappear.
Right.
Find you dead someplace.
Now, one of the things that we really need to get, we've got to get a copy of one of these agreements. It doesn't matter whether it's, the weatherman we're talking about, or whether it's a scientist who got a grant. Somehow or another, if we can get a copy of that and have some legal gurus look at that to see how bad it really is from the standpoint of punishing these people.
Yeah.
I believe it talks about jail time, financial fines, loss of job.
Oh, sure.
It's got to be so onerous that no one in their right mind would ever go against it. Because that's what we're seeing, you know. These pilot, I knew this pilot, and I cornered him. I said, "Hey, why are you guys spraying that stuff up there?" He said, "What spray?" I went outside and I said, "Look up there right now." He said, I don't, that's a Contrail. He said, now pilots know that they're not Contrail.
Exactly.
So here's this guy lying to me. Same thing with the guy from 9/11 Truth who said he wanted me to go up. He said the only way he'd believe that that was a chemtrail was for me to go up and capture some of the toxic spray somehow with some device and then bring it down and have it tested. And of course, you know, I'm not going to be able to do that.
Well, that's an easy way to do it, right? Because he knows you can't do that, so that's going to basically bring the conversation to a halt.
But, you know, the other thing is that a good pilot would know everything about his plane at all times, even though they don't have rear-view mirrors on their planes, I'm sure. They have some way to know what's coming out the back. Because I believe that, you know, many of these guys are not in control of these controls of the spraying. I think it's done by satellites. I'm sure you've heard of that before, where it's all controlled by a central facility or multiple facilities.
Yeah, computerized, yep.
Yeah, so they're not really, there's no pilot in the American Airlines plane throwing a switch saying, okay, spray on, spray off. That's a bunch of bull. Now, they may be doing that in the military aircraft, but on the commercial planes, that's not happening. So any good pilot, just like anybody who's good at anything, always knows what their equipment is doing at all times, especially a pilot, because his life depends on that aircraft. And if that aircraft's doing something weird, you would certainly know it, you know. And in fact, you would walk around the plane and inspect it before you even take off. And, of course, we've all seen those pictures of the jets, you know, the jets, but the sprayer ports, whatever they call them, on some planes. Other planes, I think they're actually embedded in the engine housing.
Yep.
You know, so I guess it's a mixed bag depending on what kind of plane you're flying and what generation it is. But in any event, these pilots all know for that reason, plus they see the spray coming out of other planes that they're going with. And, of course, we've all seen the planes that are... I've actually plotted planes that are within 500 yards of each other, approximately. One spraying and the other's not. And they both have the same flight number. The same flight number. Now, I called FAA on that and said, hey, how can you guys have two planes within 500 yards, both commercial aircraft, one spraying and the other is not, and they both have the same flight number? And what I discussed, and by the way, they said, oh, we don't control that. That's what the FAA guy told me on the helpline. That's controlled by the airlines. So I said, so if one of those planes went down and crashed, I said, which one would you believe it was, since they both had the same flight number? He said, oh, the air traffic controllers would know that. And that was a really bad answer, I thought. You know, So, you know, what it is, if you've ever noticed it, there's two planes oftentimes. They'll be going from Atlanta to Washington, D.C., let's say, and they're within a few hundred yards of each other. They both have the same number. One's spraying and the other isn't. I'm not quite sure why they do it that way. But in any event, once they get to, you know, Washington, one will go to Dulles and the other one disappears. And why do I say he disappears? He fell off my tracker. So I don't know where he went. He might have gone to an Air Force base right there.
Yeah. What I've noticed is I have a great pair of Celestron binoculars, and you know, I'll take them out and I'll take a look. And the planes, many of the planes that I see spraying are windowless, and I believe that they are military. And a lot of times, what I've noticed, well, many times I should say, I see the planes flying in North Carolina for the listeners, so you can get a reference here, flying from the south heading north. Occasionally you'll see a plane going north-south, but a lot of times they're coming from the south and heading north. And I've actually seen them fly 3 or 4 across. I'll take my binoculars out. I don't see any windows on these planes. These are great binoculars. And I've come to the conclusion, I can't verify this, right, but I'm wondering, Bob, if these planes are actually even manned, or are they drones? In other words, they're being flown remotely. They're being flown remote-controlled, and with no pilot in them, and their whole purpose in life is to aerosol spray.
Right. I think you're right. In fact, I think there were photos taken out in the Southwest at some airport where they found a bunch of Delta aircraft that were windowless, but the windows were painted on the outside, and a really bad job at that, as I recall. But I think you're right. Now, what's interesting about the example you gave, I've never seen 4 flying abreast like that, although I'm sure they have. I have seen 2. And it is very strange. I've even seen planes coming in from Europe, and they're spraying. And it makes you wonder, were they spraying the whole time they were coming over the Atlantic? And I don't know, of course. But, so it's just a very strange case here that we see with this spraying activity. One of the things that I wanted to do and set up teams to go do some of these things was to get the real straight information in terms of, first of all, how are those engines working in most cases? Are they, in fact, spraying it out, as I've seen in some videos where they spray it into the engine compartment, but it doesn't mix with the fuel. It just is ejected from the engine housing with the exhaust of the fuel. That's one way. The other way is where they actually eject it out of the aircraft through these sprayer ports. But, those kind of details, those are the kind of things I like to know about so that we actually know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
How do these things work? Are there big tanks in the belly of the plane that hold the chemicals? Or is it mixed with the fuel? These are all things I don't absolutely know the answers to. Maybe some people do. But I think we need to really get to be as knowledgeable as we can about how these things are working. I think it will help us a lot as we go down this path of trying to figure out what it is and how do we stop it,
Have you done any work, Bob, on any investigation into why they spray?
I know that they supposedly spray to reflect the sunlight, but I also have my own opinion that I think it's a more sinister thing than that. But let me just touch on the fact of the reflecting of the sunlight, for example. I posted an article the other day on one of these sites about, when you go to the beach in the summer, and you live here in North Carolina, so I know you go to the beach like the rest of us do, since we have such great beaches here. And when you go to the beach, you put a beach umbrella up, okay? Now, if you want to protect your skin, you put it up pretty much when you get there at 10 o'clock or whatever, 11 o'clock. And you don't want to be in the midday sun without any protection, right? So you put that umbrella up. So why is it that I see these planes, and you see them too, sure, why do we see them spraying in the late afternoon after the sun's already gone by? And my theory there is that they actually want to allow us to get heated up from the sun, which is overhead at noontime, and then they put a blanket on us at the end of the day to try to hold the heat in.
Yep.
So that's my theory there is that I think it's a bunch of bull, okay, that's reflecting of the sunlight. Now, there is a haze that we see up there, and that haze is pretty much up there all day long. And that, in fact, could have some reflectivity qualities to it, I'm not sure. But it's certainly not like a thick blanket, and it's certainly not heavy cloud cover. So it is a little strange, and I suspect that there are some other reasons there. And, of course, once you go down that hole, this is like another passing through the membrane example. When you start going down this path, if we didn't lose a lot of people before, you'll start to see them, you'll lose them as you go down that path of why are they doing it. If it's a sinister reason, which it could be, it's a tricky path that we go down,
Well, I know a lot of people complain about having lethargy, cold symptoms, allergies, aches and pains, and feeling out of sorts, if you will, on days where they spray, especially days where they spray heavily. So, along with blocking the sun, which I believe that it's definitely one of their objectives, because humans need the sun. The sun is a life force, and the vitamin D is one example. But I also believe that they are trying to keep the population sick. And there's a whole other set of things that attach to that, right? We could talk about the pharmaceutical industry and so on and so forth. But
let's take that point a moment, just examine it more carefully. For example, the other day I did an analysis on how many flights there are in the world every day. There's 100,000 flights every day across the world. Believe it or not, that's a big number, 100,000. And then I backed off of that as to, I assume that about a third of these commercial aircraft are probably equipped to do spraying. It could be higher, but let's assume it's a third. Because I do see planes that don't spray.
Yeah.
So I'm going to assume that they're not all equipped to do that for whatever the reason. And then add back in the military. So what I got up to was about 45,000 flights of the 100,000 a day that are potentially spraying. And I tried to go into a reverse analysis here to figure out what is it costing. But what I want to get at to with my discussion on that topic right now is that means there's that many opportunities, there's that many airports, not 100,000 airports, but there's many, many airports where these facilities are that they load the fuel or load the chemicals. Now, can you imagine the job it would be to have a security process by which you actually protect it? Let's say you had the best of intents for this crazy geoengineering program, and you didn't want to have anything get into that spray that would harm people, although we know it does. That would be a Herculean task to try to have security to protect all those areas. Now, I have heard, by the way, that where these facilities do exist on the airport grounds, there is some strict security. But, the point is, if you have that many facilities that are actually loading chemicals or fuel that has chemicals in it, what are the odds, I guess, that you could actually have some devious person or devious group load something into that fuel or chemicals, right, that would, in fact, do what you just said?
Yep. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I'll tell you a little story, and this is a story I don't tell very often, but going back about, I want to say, maybe 4 years ago, I was out in San Francisco, and I was attending a seminar. The class that we had, there was about 20 people in it, and so I was, and I was still doing the blog back then. There was a gentleman that was there. He was an elderly guy. He was probably in his mid-60s, and he came over to me at the end of one of the days of the class, the seminar we were in, and it was probably about 5:30 in the evening, and he sat down next to me, and he said, "So, Mike, tell me a little something about yourself. What brought you to the class and all this stuff and whatnot?" So, so we had a little conversation, just to kind of kick it off, and it was kind of interesting. So I said to him, "So, what do you do, or what did you do prior to coming to this class?" So he said to me, "Well, I used to work for the NSA. I'm retired now." So I said, "Well, that's kind of interesting." But I had the whole sense, Bob, as I was speaking to him, that he knew what I was involved in. He knew I was involved in that blog, and so I mean, I'm not stupid. The guy comes from across the room. He's sitting across the room the whole time, and then he comes over at 5:30, and he sits down next to me, and he wants to have a conversation. So I'm like, okay, that's fine. So I wanted to see if I can leverage this discussion with him, and so I said to him, "So you're retired from the NSA?" He goes, "Yeah." I said, "Oh, okay." So I said, "Well," I told him I did this blog, and he was like, "Oh, okay." He goes, "What types of things you get into?" So I told him. So I said, "Look, I have a couple of questions for you." I said, "Would you mind answering them?" He says, "Well, I can answer what I can answer." He says, "It's just some things I can't talk about." I'm like, okay. So we got to the whole thing about the chemtrails. And I think that was maybe the first question I asked him. When I said to him, "So the chemtrails, the spraying," I said, "Yes or no? Are they spraying or not?" He started laughing. He says, "Of course they're spraying." Right? So I started laughing, and I said, "Well, there's a lot of people," I said, "that think that, it's just contrails," and he just, continued to laugh. So I said to him, and this was very disturbing to me, right? So I said to him, "So what are they doing up there?" He says, "Well, they're checking dispersal rates." So I said, "They're checking dispersal rates? Dispersal rates for what?" So he said, "Well, for warfare." And he was talking in terms of biological warfare. And he said to me that, now, the people listening to this could be saying, "Well, Mike, this guy may have been pulling your leg." Maybe, okay, but I know somebody else has done some very deep research into this that backs into what this gentleman told me 4 years ago. And he said that they have the technology down to where they can affect specifics within DNA. This is what he told me 4 years ago. So in other words, if they wanted to target a specific group of people, specific types of, I guess, DNA configurations. I'm not a scientist on this stuff, so please bear with me. He said that they can do that. So I looked at him and I said to him, I said, "You realize," I said, "that's complete lunacy, right? You realize that this is just craziness, that it's gotten to this point." I said, for what purpose? For what purpose would you push the envelope to that degree? And he said to me, "Look, Mike," I swear to God, he said this to me, Bob. I could not believe it. He says, "Mike, look, there's too many people on the planet already." I looked at him.
We've heard that, of course.
Yeah.
So, but the point you're raising there, interestingly enough, just yesterday, I think it was, the Seattle area. I don't know if you saw this. They're going to spray their Gypsy Moths, and I know what a Gypsy Moth is. I had them up in Massachusetts when I lived there years ago. It was nasty. In fact, my wife was pregnant with our first child, and she actually had to leave the area because what I'd have to do at the end of the day, every day I'd come home from work, I'd have to spray the side of the house I'd hose them off, first of all. They'd be covering the outside of the house, these gypsy, they weren't moths at this point, they were caterpillars, but they called them Gypsy Moths. And then I'd have to hit them with, some toxic chemical to kill them when they were on the ground. And that went on for, a couple of weeks. But anyway, out in Seattle, they're going to spray a bacteria. I saw the article the other day. They're going to spray the whole area with a bacteria that's supposed to attack the Gypsy Moths. Now, of course, that bacteria is going to affect the people, too, that are underneath the plane. So I thought that was pretty crazy, and some people were objecting to it, but it almost sounded like they were going to let it go. So can you imagine? They're now going to spray insects. Years ago, we used to have a truck, I think, up in Massachusetts. He would go around with a sprayer on the back of a pickup truck, and they would spray for mosquitoes. And we hated that, when they did that, too. But they did it. And I think nowadays that, of course, would be prohibited. This was back in the 70s. And but now out in Seattle area, they're going to be spraying for Gypsy Moths from a big tanker.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They have been spraying since the 1950s. In fact, I have an alternate YouTube channel where basically it's not radio shows. I find very interesting clips, and I kind of tuck them away. It's like having a little closet, a little file cabinet where I can put stuff if I ever have to go back and have some source information. But there was a 1952 Navy film that was made, and it was declassified recently. In fact, I put it up on my YouTube channel back in October of 2015. And it was the U.S. Navy's plans for offensive biological and chemical warfare. It's like a 15-minute clip, and all they talk about, Bob, is spraying. And they talk about how important aerosols are to warfare. And I was talking to Jack Hart, who is, he's does a lot of deep research into this stuff, and I had sent him the clip, and he writes articles for Veterans Today, and he started laughing. I said, "You watched that clip, right?" He goes, "Yeah." He goes, "They weren't talking about maybe they would do this. They weren't saying that they wouldn't do it. Basically, what they were saying was they need to find and develop a bigger gun, a bigger hose in order to do the spraying." So this goes back to the 1950s. So we're talking about 60 plus years where they've been involved in spraying in one way or another, some shape or form, whether it be spraying over major cities, and they've done this. They sprayed, in San Francisco, they sprayed in New York, they sprayed in Chicago. They've done a lot of spraying over in the UK, in Britain. So this is not like new stuff. This is not conjecture or some kind of crazy conspiracy. They've already done this stuff.
Right. Well, that DNA thing that you mentioned, I did see a video where they showed some Department of Defense guys. You may have seen that video as well, where they were showing how they were going to spray over Iraq and convert, what they call those bombers, suicide bombers, I guess. They're going to convert the DNA of these bombers so they wouldn't do that anymore.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So that was pretty crazy. So I'm sure they did do it. Whether it worked or not, who knows? But so they're doing all kinds of stuff like that, and they're not telling us. Now, one of the things I think that contributes to that is the fact that they're on autopilot. I seem to think that somehow they get funded for something, whatever the heck it is. Of course, the Congress is so bad that they don't really dig into anything anyway. But even if they did, they wouldn't go into that level of detail to go check into these things and to see what's happening. So I tend to think, and geoengineering I think is in the same category, it's on autopilot. At some point in the past, they did something. They made a decision to go do something, and it's been running on autopilot. The other thing I believe, and one of the points I made in my article the other day was that it's costing us, I believe, anywhere from $500 billion to $1 trillion a year to run geoengineering. And I could be off, but that's a lot of money, given that our budget's $3.3 trillion, excuse me. So if you've got a $500 billion to $1 trillion of funding, it's certainly not in the budget.
Right.
You won't find it in the budget anymore. So where's that money coming from? And I believe that money is coming from the nation's credit card. It's just printed. basically they print that money, and that goes into our debt. And that's why our debt has gone up to $19 trillion during the Obama administration. You know, it went from $5 trillion to $19 trillion from the time George Bush went into office till now.
Yeah.
And most of that has been under Obama.
And that's only the number that you can actually count, that, you know, that we can kind of find on the books.
Right.
There's a whole lot of stuff that's going on off the books, and that never makes it on somebody's computer screen with regard to the quote unquote the government. You know, and the reason why a lot of these, not a lot of them, but essentially why all of these politicians don't talk about this is because what people don't realize is that in this global structure, this worldwide structure, the politicians are low-level flacks, and they're there as a veneer to give the impression that you have government, that you have representative government, and they're there to represent you. All of this stuff that's taking place with geoengineering as an example, the spraying, this is all shadow government activity. This is all covert black ops activity.
Right.
And, you know, if you're a congressman or a congressperson, you're not going to step up to the plate and start talking about this. Because if you do, they're going to tell you to shut up. And if you don't shut up, then there's going to be problems. At the very least, what they'll do is they'll make sure you never get elected again. That's at the very least.
That's true.
So that's the big problem that we face. What a lot of people don't realize is that the people that we're trying to get the attention of, these people are puppets. They're paid and bought, and they have been told what it is they can talk about and what it is they can't talk about. And that's the dilemma that we have. At least that's, you know, from my perspective. I don't want to sound like doom and gloom here. It's because somebody could say, okay, Mike, well, is it game over? What do we do? I think it's a multifaceted approach where you have to expose the fact that you have a shadow government. You have to expose that the people that are on your TV screen, sitting in Congress, or the guy sitting in the White House, they're not the puppet masters.
That's right. And some of the things I know I wanted to mention briefly before we close.
Yeah, go ahead.
Some of the things I think we need to do, for example, with people that I know that think I'm crazy, and they think chemtrails are crazy, right? We somehow have to get down to their level to explain to them how this is impacting their lives and the things that they consume. Like, for example, organic foods. Somebody goes to a lot of care to not use pesticides and things like that, okay, when they grow those organic crops. And then here comes the chemtrail plane overhead, dropping aluminum, barium, strontium, and God knows what else. Could be coal fly ash, whatever.
Right.
On the leaves of that plant, okay? Now that plant, you know, may be getting washed off. Who knows what's actually happening to it? But that stuff is getting in the rainwater. The rainwater's going up into the plants. These people have no clue that what they think they're eating it contains these other contaminants that they know nothing about.
That's right. That's right.
So that affects pistachios, almonds. I'm just picking a couple here. Pistachios, almonds, crops, wine. People that have vineyards, the same thing's happening to the grapes, right?
Right.
So everything we consume that's grown outside, unless it's in a protected, well, even if it's in a protected thing, from what I understand, the nano-sized particles will go right through it. So it almost doesn't matter where you put these crops or plants. They're going to absorb this material. So somehow we've got to get that information down to the people. And the other thing we got to do is, like, people that spend a lot of time outside, could be campers, boaters, swimmers, athletes of any type, people that like the outdoors. Guess what? You know, they're breathing this stuff in all the time.
Yep.
And also we know that with the other stuff they're doing in geoengineering, they're destroying the ozone and other protection systems that the Earth provides us from the dangerous UV rays.
Right, right.
So, I mean, there's a whole cast of characters here that are doing harm to us that people don't have any clue about. Somehow we've got to get that information to them. Now, of course, they may reject that information when we deliver it to them. But that's something I see as one of the challenges. The only way we're going to convince these folks is to bring it down and show them, and also show them what's happening to other people that are being harmed by this stuff. The Alzheimer's people. I told you earlier that I had contacted an Alzheimer's researcher at the Salk Institute. He was blaming everything on Roundup. I said, well, okay, Roundup could be a problem. There's no question about that. We hate Roundup, right? We hate Monsanto.
Right.
What about the bees and stuff that are out in the woods where there is no Roundup, and they're also dying, you know? And of course, these guys have no answer for that, you know. So, but he was saying that the Roundup was somehow getting into the food, which was getting into the stuff that the Alzheimer's patients were eating, and blah, blah, blah. Completely ignoring the geoengineering element here that exists.
Yeah.
And I see that all the time. And here again, I think it goes back to when he went back to his boss, if he had a boss at the Salk Institute, he was probably told to shut up, you know, because the Salk Institute is probably getting big money from the federal government. And here again, we find the role of money absolutely preventing us from making any progress in many of these areas, you know.
Well, that's what they do. It's done with money, and you know, and if the money doesn't do it, then like you and I said before, then it goes to Plan B. You know, you'll threaten your employment, which essentially is money oriented. But
right.
But you know, they have the tactics that they use. It's basically to instill fear in people. That's it. I mean, make people fearful, and fear is paralyzing. Once a person becomes fearful, they essentially just stop. You know.
Well, now, Mike, you're an independent. You work for yourself, right?
Yep.
Okay, so do I. So I noticed one of the things that, as I got into this, I didn't really care what anybody thought, and I didn't have to care. It was much different than when I worked for corporate America.
Right.
I used to work for AVL, for example. You know, last thing I want to do is run through the halls of AVL and tell them about chemtrails if I know that there's pressure coming down from management that, hey, we're not talking about that stuff, you know. And, of course, at the time I worked there, I didn't even know what a chemtrail was. But I imagine people have to worry about that with their employers. So I think, you know, you and I, we work for ourselves. You know, we don't really care what other people think, I'm sure, in terms of this whole issue. At least I don't. And so that allows me to stretch my wings. I don't really care what they think. But how many of those, like ourselves, are there out there? I know there's a lot, but there's still a lot of people that are employed, and that's one of our barriers here as well. They may think one thing privately, but they're going to be very careful in how they express that.
Well, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, I spent 32 years in the corporate world too, Bob, and I know exactly what you're saying. You know, you can't walk around talking about this stuff because, first of all, these multinational corporations they have large government contracts. If somebody's out there going off about this stuff, I mean, it's just not going to fly. They have guidelines with regard to your conduct while you're employed. Those guidelines say that you can't engage in certain types of activities or certain types of speech. In other words, if you engage in behavior outside of your job that can negatively impact the company, that is grounds for that company to let you go.
Right.
So you're absolutely right. This is what's hanging over people's heads. Now, I have my own practice now, yes. So that gives me a lot of flexibility to be myself. But there's a lot of people that don't have the situation that you and I have.
Well, let me give you another example. I do have a partner, my wife, in my business. So what I can't do, I'm restricted, and I understand that. I'm restricted from discussing this with my customers or our customers.
Yeah.
And I accept that because I can't impact her status either as a regular person. If she's a partner with me and we're saying this to our customers, there's a risk that we might turn people off. So
right.
When it comes to our own customers, we do have to be careful there. But other than that, I'm going to speak to anybody I want outside of that customer relationship situation. But right there, you can see that there's still a connection for even guys like you and me that we have to still worry a little bit. But I think the average worker has to worry a lot, unfortunately. And the other thing I noticed the other day is that people that work in an office who may not have access to the Internet in the way that I do throughout my work day. I can watch things on the Internet while I'm working in my shop. So, I'm not restricted in any way in that sense. What I'm getting at is I think these other folks have less time, quite frankly, than people like I do. Because I can multiplex and do multiple things at the same time, whereas they probably can't. So I think that also works against us trying to get the information out. They have less time. When they do have free time, they may want to watch that stupid show on TV that we talked about earlier.
Right.
And they may not want to get into the things that you and I enjoy doing. But So I think we have time issues, we have job issues, we have a lot of stuff that confront or prevent us, I should say, from trying to deliver this message. So, so given all that, what I've concluded is that rather than try to bring everybody else on, although I think we still have to have people try to do that, I think we're going to be more successful if we take the forces that we have and try to come up with strategies and tactics that get to some endpoint of doing something. You know, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take the FAA case. You know, I'm not giving up on the FAA. I want to find out more about some of these things that don't make sense that they keep telling me when I call them, you know. Same thing with the EPA. I want to get a hold of the EPA because, by the way, the FAA told me that the EPA is responsible for anything coming out the back end of a plane. I thought that was a very interesting statement that they said.
Yeah.
Said they have nothing to do with anything coming out the back of the plane, meaning the chemicals. They said if you see chemicals coming out of the back of the plane, you better call the EPA. So that's what I'm going to call.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you I'm going to be told when I call the EPA that I better call the FAA. You know, it'll be a vicious circle. So, but the point is, we have to dig deep and try to push these people to get the answers. And I try to escalate it, too. I try to find out the guy's supervisor. I want to bring it up at a higher level here. This is totally unacceptable.
Right.
I've even issued some, what do you call those things, FOIA requests. Of course, they go into a dark hole. I don't think you ever hear back from some of those things on different topics. But I think if we get more and more people to try to push back against these organizations and ask them the tough questions, eventually we got to have some impact there. But it may be just wishful thinking. I don't know.
No, I don't think it's wishful thinking at all. I think as the public becomes more and more aware, Bob, they're not going to be able to duck and weave and hide anymore. The thing is to get to a point where you have critical mass. I don't know what that number is, but I can tell you that I have woken some people up, and I've done it on Facebook and through the blog and so on and the radio shows. I've had people on my Facebook going back a couple of years ago just thinking that I was just nuts, about these chemtrails and so on. And then slowly but surely I kept putting stuff up there. And the key is to put intelligent information up, not slop. Right? And if it's presented in an intelligent, professional way, it's an analysis, it's somebody who's done research, the person articulates well, then you can start to get people to pay attention. And I have swung some folks over, and they have written to me and said, you know what, 2 or 3 years ago I thought you were crazy, but you're not. I see this now. I see this, So that's the good thing. So I think we are waking people up.
Great, that's great. Well, I know we're near the end here. I just want to say that, we have a lot of other things, too. I'm sure guys like you and me are engaged in. I'm constantly looking at the potential financial collapse that's right down the road, the collapse of the dollar and other stuff. The debt situation. By the way, on the debt, I think that debt that we have, I can never find anywhere that shows what we actually got for that debt. And what I concluded was that wasn't anything that we had spent. It was just for obligations to foreign bankers and others, investors. We never got anything for that money. I don't think we should pay that debt, by the way. And I think we should just walk away from it, just like we would if we were bankrupt. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
So that's just a point I wanted to make. But, we have other things coming at us. We have potential wars. The government's desperate to have a war so they can hide all this dirty laundry behind the war. And I'm afraid that when these things break wide open, the geoengineering thing is going to get pushed to the back, and people will forget about it, or they won't be able to spend enough time on it. And that'll be a real shame if that happens, because that's the one thing that in the end will kill us all.
Well, that's what they do, right? As soon as the public starts to focus in on something and they're getting a little too close, a little too aware, some other distraction comes about. There'll be some war. There'll be some false flag. There'll be some shooting someplace. They're actually masterful at what they do, diverting and distracting to keep everybody disoriented, to keep them disengaged, so that there isn't this unity. That's what they do. They don't want unity. So so I completely hear what you're saying. But I think the chemtrail thing, to be honest with you, I think it's a staple now. What we discuss is a lot of people that still are unaware, don't buy into it. But you know what, Bob? If you go back 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, there's a lot more people now that are paying attention to it, in my view.
True. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think you're right. If we keep the pressure up and keep speaking intelligently and and analyzing it. The other thing that's happening, though, I would say, Mike, is that they are doing a better job with the technology of hiding or creating clouds and hiding chemtrails and stuff like that. They're getting much better, unfortunately. I hate to see the day where they can actually spray stuff out and it doesn't show up at all.
Yeah.
And that will be extremely scary because we won't know what the heck is going on, you know?
Right. That's right.
And one last thing I'll say is, you know, you say that they are doing a lot of these things. I know they're engaged in all these false flags and things, but one thing I see in all these things is that they're like the Keystone Cops. Every single thing they do, they expose themselves. We can always find, within days of the event, people are on them like a pit bull terrier.
Yep.
And they'll find out where the false story was. It's uncanny how the army of people we have out there on the internet are constantly looking after what's going on, and it's great to see because they do a far better job than any media organization could have ever done in terms of getting the truth.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the media is not there to get to the truth. The media is there. That's the Ministry of Propaganda.
Yeah, you're right. So, anyway, Mike, hey, I enjoyed this discussion. Hopefully we can do it again sometime on any number of subjects. There's so many things going on. I often say to myself, we could have an army of 300 researchers sitting in a building somewhere and just constantly working 24/7, and we still wouldn't be able to keep up with all the crimes of the government.
No. The rabbit hole is very, very, very deep. Very deep. Bob, your website, though, right? www.gawss.org, gauze.org?
Yeah, that's the one I relate to, the chemtrail stuff, and I'm constantly putting things up there. At some point, I actually want people to come and they can actually post things on there and plot where they've seen planes, and the location where they are will show up on a map. So there's a lot of things like that I'm trying to make more interactive. One of the things I want to get is a poll where people are constantly saying, "Hey, we want to keep track of the different patterns. What time of the day are they spraying? What kind of sprays are they doing? Are they lingering sprays? Are they there's hazy sprays?" And somehow or another, we need to capture a lot of that data, I think, and actually map it out. So I'm going to try to continue to have those capabilities built into the site, but I don't have them all there at this point. But yeah, the website is gawss.org. It stands for Global Air, Water, Soil Safety. They sort of ran out of other things, so I had to come up with something like that.
No, it's pretty good. Very good.
gawss.org, not .com.
Okay.
Okay?
All right, Bob. Well, look, it's been a pleasure having you on, and it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it too, Mike, and I hope to do it again sometime.
We will.
And that concludes another Sage of Quay interview, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Links to my guests' websites and social media are listed in the show notes below. And as always, I'd like to thank everyone for listening and visiting the blog. You can get to the blog by typing in sageofquayradio.blogspot.com or simply head over to our hub website at sageofquay.com. Also, if you get a moment, please visit laboroflovemusic.com to listen to my album, Leaving Dystopia. And remember, live in truth and always serve creation. It's really that simple. See everyone next week. Be safe, enjoy, and God bless.